Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our June 17th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today you'll hear from Dr. Jason Henderson, who's an ag economist and the vice president of Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. Dr. Henderson's going to offer us some analysis of Iowa's current ag economy and explore some keys that he sees for future economic success. And later in the episode, we'll bring on Hans Riensche, a young farmer from northeastern Iowa who's going to be studying ways for farm families to sustainably transition to future generations through the Nuffield International Farming Scholars Program. First up is Dr. Jason Henderson, a Fayette County native who now serves as the vice president of ISU Extension. Spokesman reporter Bob Beyond caught up with Dr. Henderson late last month.
Welcome, Jason, and thanks for being with us today. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself? You've been with Iowa State University as Vice President of Extension and Outreach Programs for a little more than a year now and came from Purdue University, but you have some Iowa roots.
Yeah, I was born and raised on a dairy farm in Arlington, Iowa, up in Fayette County. Our family moved off the farm, moved to town during the mid-'80s. Then I went to college at Central College in Pella, graduated there with an economics degree before I went on to graduate school at Purdue.
So with ISU Extension, what are some early accomplishments and maybe some goals that you have for the future?
One of the early accomplishments is emerging digital ag program that's supporting farm profitability by helping farmers adopt new technologies and not just new big equipment, but how to upgrade their older equipment and to help them, for example, through our Planter U university programs, help them plant faster and more precisely. So we've been doing this the last couple of years through Planter U. We've been able to receive some additional state funding last year and are now launching Combine U this fall to do some of the same thing with the harvesting. And then the next step after that is to buy some additional drones and see what we can do like for spray season and doing those different things. So that's one example. And we hope to expand the technology programs and helping farmers adopt new technologies, and starting this on the crop side, but then it's turning around of what does it mean for livestock sectors, the technologies that they need. The other thing I want to highlight is 4-H. We're the largest youth development program in the state, and so how do we strengthen the 4-H clubs? And so just one thing to highlight is that we've been doing STEM activities, and Louisa County had a 4-H club, did an energy audit at their school, then worked with a renewable energy company to install some solar panels at the school. That's going to save the school $1.5 million over the lifetime of the panels. And now the club is working with the city to do the same thing on city buildings. So it's just a different way we're engaging youth to think about some of the challenges that communities have in terms of energy costs, rising energy costs. How do we deal with that? And just something new, different, unique that we're being able to do with 4-H.
Yeah, so what have you enjoyed most so far in your new role? It sounds like you've been out and about across Iowa visiting with farmers and the ag industry.
It's been fun. The first thing is just relearning Iowa. You see things differently as a 50-year-old than when you're 19. I enjoyed the Iowa Farm Field Days of community visits. I've been around talking to Extension Council members in different places. I've been able to get reacquainted with people that I haven't seen since college, and I've also discovered that I have relatives that I never knew I had before. They say Kevin Bacon has 6 degrees of separation, and it's obvious that he's not from Iowa because it would be 1 to 2 degrees of separation if he was. So just getting reacquainted with the state and learning what's going on, understanding what some of the challenges that our farmers and our families and our businesses are facing here, but more importantly, the opportunities, and how can Extension help them? How can we be a catalyst for growth and to help them kind of overcome some of the barriers and help them see some of these opportunities?
Recently, you were a presenter at the 96th Annual Soil Management and Land Valuation Conference in Ames and talked about the ag economy both in the States and globally. What was the main takeaway you wanted conference participants to leave with about the ag economy?
I think the main thing is that the ag economy that we've enjoyed over the last decade is different. The era of low interest rates is over, and the dynamics of agriculture and agricultural finance is shifting. It's starting to shift. So Iowa agriculture will need to be resilient. But in addition to that, of being resilient to lower profitability over the next year, I think there's some opportunities that are going to be emerging. They're just different opportunities. And so how do we help position Iowa agriculture to take advantage of these opportunities, be resilient in the short run, but just helping them understand that operating in a higher interest rate environment with higher value of the dollar means we just have to think a little bit differently about the opportunities that are going to emerge in agriculture, and how do we position Iowa agriculture to take advantage of them.
Three things that stuck out to me were your thought processes on the importance of utilizing technology and boosting production, protecting the state's water supply, and advancing processing capabilities. Maybe we could take each of those one at a time for further explanation. How about boosting production and technology first?
Production and the adoption of new technology has always been the core of Iowa agriculture. From hybrid seed corn to tractors, Iowa is just simply the epicenter of new agricultural technology. And so what is the technology of the future that will allow Iowa's farmers to reach new markets, improve efficiency, be more sustainable and conservation oriented? Iowa's farmers have always done this, but how do we do this for the new technology that's coming out just to help us do this better in the future? And I think it's focusing on how do we adopt technology of the thinking of Iowa to be both economically and environmentally sustainable moving forward. We've been doing this for all of our history, and how do we keep doing this and doing it in better ways and new ways going forward? And I think that's where the technology adoption comes in, and innovating and adopting new technologies that we haven't even discovered yet going forward. So I think that's the role. We've been doing it for a while, and how do we do it in the future?
Next was protecting the state's water supply. We've had some serious water issues the last 4 years with drought, but now we seem to be coming out of that this spring.
Yeah, I think the old adage is if you don't like Iowa's weather, just wait a few minutes, it'll change. I was talking with some faculty here over the last year, and they had, I think, the best description of Iowa's weather patterns. They're just wacky. I never heard of a derecho while growing up in Iowa. So we're getting some reprieve right now in the drought, but it's taken some intense storms to get it done, and devastation. NOAA indicates that in the last few years, Iowa has averaged $3 to $4 billion in weather-related damages each year. I think we're going to have some relief on the drought, but we're going to get drought again. It's not a matter of if, but when. So how are we going to be prepared to deal with it when we get it the next time? How are we going to be prepared for devastating storms and floods? We're going to have them in the future as well. While we might have this reprieve now here this spring with the water and some of the water supplies that we have in Clark County and Poweshiek County and different places where they're struggling with water, we're going to get drought. It's going to reemerge. So this is a good time for us to take this reprieve and plan and be prepared.
Any suggestions on actually protecting the state's water supply?
There's a lot of different things that we have some research. I was just talking to some civil engineers in the engineering department about different ways to recycle water and reuse water in different ways, and with new technologies that's coming out from a rural perspective. And so how do we take these new research and technologies that are being discovered here in Ames, and how do we work with our communities? They've been starting to have some conversations in Clark County about how to do that down there, about reusing recycling water that has already been used and then cleaning it in different ways that we can use it and turn it into quantities that we have. So there's some ideas on that. We're exploring ways, how do we do more of that? And we've done some tests and some initial collaborations in Clark County, but how do we expand that across the state? So those are some things that we're looking at doing in terms of research and innovation on campus, of how we can bring that out to communities across Iowa.
So then let's touch on advancing processing capabilities in Iowa. You had mentioned processing locally and selling to our neighbors. How can we grow processing statewide, boost value-added agriculture?
In the last ag census, USDA reported that Iowa's farmers increased their direct farm to retail company sales from 15 million to 127 million between 2017 and 2020. In addition, direct consumer sales, farmers markets, those types of activities, they also grew rapidly. So how do we lean into that And how do we expand that? Can it be a billion-dollar industry for Iowa going forward? Iowa, we're known for our ag commodities. We produce corn, soybeans, meat products, and then we ship it out to the rest of the world for them to process and add value and jobs in their communities. How does Iowa become known as a food state, where we take our ag commodities, we process them here, we add value here, we create jobs here, and we sell food? I think Iowa's blessed, where we sit in the middle of Minneapolis and Kansas City and St. Louis, Chicago, Milwaukee, Omaha. And how do we harvest and process and sell Iowa food through retail distribution to people in these regional markets and enhance value and provide jobs here? And here at Iowa State Extension and Outreach, we're going to be making some additional investments over the next couple of months in this space to support Iowa as a food state. We have collaborations with IDOLs and the small business development centers to help make some of this happen. And we're going to work hard to expand these collaboration. And more is going to come over the next year. But for us in Extension and Outreach, we want to lean into this space. And how do we not only provide agricultural commodities for export, but how do we turn some of our agricultural commodities into food products and add value and jobs here in Iowa?
So how about challenges? The challenges the ag sector faces going forward. We've touched on weather and water availability. Any other challenges that the ag sector will face?
Weather is always a risk. It always has been. I think only in Iowa can you have drought and floods in the same week. But at the same point in time, I think labor is going to be another challenge. Quantity of labor is going to be, how do we attract labor to Iowa? Our population growth has lagged behind the rest of the nation. And so how do we think about attracting the next generation of people to Iowa to work for labor supply? How do we think about the next generation of farmers into agriculture is going to be key, I think, for agriculture going forward. So I think labor is going to be a huge challenge that we have to think about. And I think the second thing is there's a lot of questions that have been emerging about the urban and the ag and the urban and rural interface of what does that look like. Here in Iowa, we're seeing our urban communities grow on that part of it, and a lot of transition of agricultural land into urban development. So how do we think about in terms of what's that urban-rural interface? How does agriculture engage with urban development? What does that lead to going forward? Because in Iowa, not only do we have a labor challenge, we have a housing challenge as well for the people that we do have. So those are some things that we have to think about and the impacts on agriculture.
So what about financial risks? You touched on a few of these a little bit, but where do we see land values headed and ag lending as examples, short-term and long-term? What about interest rates, inflation? You mentioned a financial shift in the ag sector. We can kind of take these one at a time. So first, how about land values?
Yeah, I would expect some softening in land values, and we've already seen it in some places. Fewer people showing up at land auctions, a little bit softer prices in that aspect of it. That's really going to be driven by the expected declines in profitability we think are going to happen as commodity prices have fallen over the last year. Also higher interest rates. And so declines in profitability and higher interest rates are always a recipe for lower land values. So I think that's what we're going to expect to see is some softening and seeing how that plays out over the next couple of years.
Okay, how about ag lending?
Ag lending, I think we're at a time frame now where interest rates are not going to be at historically low levels. They're back to their historical averages. Farm loans are around 8%, depending on your risk profile as you go in and talk to your financer. Over the past decade, agriculture has been a huge benefit with low interest rates. So ag financing is really focused in on how do you lock in your debt using a long-term fixed interest rate loan product. And that's been the goal for the last decade, long-term fixed interest rates. Now with these higher rates, more farmers are going to be utilizing variable rate loans, shorter term durations on that to see what the interest rate fluctuations do to take advantage of lower rates potentially in the future. But I think that lending is going to be a little bit different. The other part with lower profitability, bankers will be looking at risk profiles a little more closely with the prospects of lower profitability going forward. So that's something that agriculture is going to have to go through, just a little more scrutiny on future profitability.
Where do you think we'll see interest rates go in the next year?
So I think interest rates are probably going to hover around different places where we're at, slightly lower interest rates in the future if we can deal with inflation. But they have not yet pulled back. There's been these expectations the Federal Reserve would cut rates starting here in the summer, but they've signaled now that they're going to hold rates steady. So this is kind of where I think it's going to be around this current range, and it might decline a little bit if we can deal with some inflation that's happening out there. But this ballpark of farm loan and interest rates, about 8%, is probably what we should expect going forward.
Okay, so yeah, inflation, where do we see that going?
Inflation is most likely going to remain above Federal Reserve targets. And so the Federal Reserve wants inflation target to be about 2%. Right now, the inflation expectations measures based on surveys and also different market rates has inflation hovering between 3 and 3.5% going forward. So inflation is going to be above the Federal Reserve targets. That's just the underpinning for them to keep interest rates at the current levels, higher than what it was over the past decade. So that's what we're going to be expecting. Inflation down from what it was in 2023 when it was pushing 8 to 10%, but above the Federal Reserve targets of 2%.
You also mentioned a possible financial shift. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so you're getting a lot more scrutiny. So if you farmers go into their lenders of looking at the risk profile, what's the profitability aspects of it? There's been shifts in lending, a little bit of more scrutiny, but also questions about what type of investments are farmers going to do. Areas of higher interest rates and lower profitabilities, do farmers buy the new equipment? Do farmers put up the new building? Do they build grain bins? Those types of things. You're starting to see some of those investments pull back in agriculture. You're seeing investments that are being made using more variable rate loans than fixed rate loans. And I think those are a little more scrutiny on the type of investments that farmers are making going forward.
How about the export opportunities for Iowa farmers and for U.S. farmers? Where are we seeing exports headed in 2024 and beyond?
The U.S. and Iowa will continue to be a dominant player in the export markets for agricultural commodities and will always be a dominant player feeding the world. One of the challenges that we'll be facing in agriculture going forward is the strong value of the dollar. That's going to challenge our exports going forward because a strong dollar makes agricultural commodities more expensive relative to our competitors, say Brazil. And so it challenges our position as a preferred provider in some places on international markets where they're looking for lower cost commodities. And so I think that's one of the risks that we have to go forward, is that it's going to be a challenging position because of the dollar in global markets on that part. So we have a lot of risk in the export market space. Another one is what's the risk of going to happen with all the wars and armed conflicts that are happening out there? Ukraine is the breadbasket of Eastern Europe. So how does that play out in terms of production there? Can they produce as much as they have in the past? How does that impact the demand for U.S. commodities? We have to monitor and follow that. And I think the other challenge that we have to look at is, are there potential trade wars brewing? And I bring this up because recently we have new tariffs on China, not on agricultural products, but what's the response? What happens in terms of China's response to those tariffs that we're putting on Chinese products? Does that limit their purchases of agricultural commodities? What's their response to those types of tariffs? So there's a lot of things to pay attention to going forward. So there'll be a lot of uncertainty, but in terms of global production, I think we'll have a solid export base, but we have some headwinds that we have to deal with.
Yeah, we've touched on a lot of things with the ag economy. So let's kind of end with an overall assessment of the economy in 2024 and maybe into 2025. What can Iowa farmers and the ag industry expect to see this next year?
The U.S. economy is solid. We have low unemployment, wages are rising, and the rest of the world is again looking to the U.S. consumer to lead them out of any weakness in the world economy. We have the best looking house on the block. So trillions of dollars are flowing into the U.S. economy from international investors and companies because they view the United States as a good investment. They want to send money to the United States because they're going to get a good return on their investment because our economy is growing and it's solid. It's just a good investment. Now, one of the challenges we have is that our economy is not able to grow as fast as what we historically have been used to because we have that population challenge. Boomers are retiring, and younger generations are not large enough to offset that challenge. And ultimately, our ability to grow is based on how many people you have and how productive they are when they work. And so when you have slower population growth, that limits the potential of growth that we have from 3% growth to more in the line of 2% growth of what we can do, simply because of population and who's of working age population. So that really means that we have to have the most productive workforce in our recent history. And I think we can do that, but it's going to take a commitment to discovery and education and collaboration, and it's going to take a real commitment to innovation.
Thanks, Jason. You know, we've actually had Dr. Henderson on the podcast once before when he was brand new to his vice president role with ISU Extension. It's great to touch base with him again 1 year later and hear more about the future he sees for Iowa agriculture and ISU Extension. Next up, Hans Riensche. Hans is a Jessup, Iowa native, a 2021 ISU graduate, and the sixth generation of his family to farm in northeast Iowa. With a strong family farm tradition like the one Hans has, it's not surprising to discover that he has a keen interest in helping farm families transition to the next generation sustainably. And that's exactly the topic he'll be studying internationally through the Nuffield International Farming Scholars Program, which is a program that Iowa Farm Bureau has helped support financially for years. Spokesman editor Tom Block learned more about it late last month.
Hans, thanks for joining me today on the podcast. Can you describe for me what the Nuffield Scholarship is, how you heard about it, and what led you to apply?
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. So the Nuffield International Farming Scholarship is a program for young people in food and agriculture who are under 45-ish to be able to do a research project, travel to different farms and agribusiness operations around the world, and to take the learnings of that research project and turn around and share them with the industry. Nuffield is a nonprofit organization. All the research that's done is not proprietary. It's distributed back out to the farmers, the funders, the industry to help the people who made it possible. And I learned about it several years ago when I was at Iowa State. The person who is leading Nuffield USA had come to speak to students about the scholarship program. And while I was listening to that, I just thought, it sounded like a remarkable opportunity to get to know other producers from around the world who are facing some of the same challenges and some unique challenges, and to make a network of friends with them who we can share ideas and help each other improve our operations and communities. I can't believe it, but here I am now as a part of the organization.
Well, congratulations to you. Let's back up for a second and talk a little bit about your background. Tell us a little bit about your family, your farming operation that you're part of, and your education.
Like I said, I went to Iowa State. I studied agricultural business and international agriculture and picked up some minors in agronomy. But about halfway through my college career, I realized if I want to be a farmer, I probably should learn something about food. So I picked up some studies in human nutrition with a different minor and something called Food and Society, which is a mixture of nutrition and the history of food in the U.S. Now, the thing was, I always wanted to be a farmer. I grew up on our family's farming operation, and that's up in the Jessup area. We raise corn and soybeans, but then we also are involved in a variety of different startups and research groups that are trying to find new ways to put tools and technologies into the hands of farmers to help them improve their operations. So I spent a couple years working away from the farm to try and get some experience to bring back in addition to what I learned from school. But then I've used the Nuffield program both as a way to keep learning, but then be involved in something else as I am, finally letting out the clutch and being on the farm full time.
What specific goals did you have in mind when you applied for the scholarship? I know each of the scholars have to pick a study topic, so tell us about your study topic and what inspired your interest in it.
My topic is on how farms around the world bring in the next generation and then transition the farm onto them. And the inspiration for the project was during my time at Iowa State, you always hear about people talking around the topic of, how do you get young people back to farms? But as soon as I talked to the people who wanted to be young farmers, I kind of heard two things. One, you heard some people who grew up on farms, but, didn't really want to go back to it. But then I heard older producers who were like, well, I'd love to bring in the next generation, but there's not really room for them. And it always kind of sat in the back of my mind that, those two things are really tough, that they coexist, that you have people who want to come back and don't have a space, and there's spaces that want people and you can't get them to come back. So, we talk a lot in the US amongst ourselves on how to solve that issue. And it's fantastic, all the conversations we have, but we also should look internationally at the way that other people in other places in the world tackle the same problem, because it really is a global issue that we're facing. So there's a couple of questions that I've been wrestling with, and they're important to me because I'm the sixth generation of my family farm, and I'd really love to hand down this opportunity again to my children when I have them one day. And I know that my community feels the exact same way as well. And so if it's something that I can be a part of helping find answers for our own farm and then also our entire community as well, then I think it's a great thing to try and chase after. So that's the inspiration of the project. I'm excited to be able to give away the results at the end of it.
And there is an international study component to the scholarship. What countries will you be visiting during the next few months, and why did you choose those locations?
I sort of plotted the countries across two axes, and I looked around the world and I said, who has comparable agriculture to us and who has comparable culture to us, and laid those two axes across each other. You have nations like Australia and Canada where their agricultural systems are somewhat similar to ours and their culture is somewhat similar to ours. And on the flip side, you have places like Japan and Zimbabwe where the culture is both different and so is their agriculture. And there's something rich about learning from both sides of that coin. So I put across here a lot of the most interesting agricultural countries and have been making a go of identifying those to travel to. So here in the next month, I'm actually traveling with a team of scholars, and we're going to go from Northern Australia to Zimbabwe, to the United Kingdom, to the Netherlands, and then on to Georgia in Central Asia. So it's going to be the opportunity to get a wide breadth of exposure to different farming communities and different farming styles, especially when you think about the environments in which they farm, not only the physical environment, but also the political environment and the geopolitical environment around those people as well. So it's really about achieving a good balance of those different world perspectives and agricultural perspectives and trying to find out what they do differently and what they do the same and what we can learn from that.
Now, you're just a couple of months into your experience so far, but what have been some of the key highlights of your experience to this date?
First off, you can never understate how amazing it is to meet the other 100 scholars. So there's 100 scholars from around the world. There's 5 of us from the United States. And to be able to tap into the breadth of experience that they already have. So that's been the first major highlight. The second major highlight has been just getting an appreciation for even some of the same players that we see here in Iowa and how they do business in other countries, how adaptable they have to be in order to get seed delivered in another nation or to get products like get grain out or meat out of another country. It's just fascinating to see how their operations work. And I think it gives me a better understanding than I had of so many of the companies that we do business with on the daily. And so I've really just appreciated getting to see so much more out of both the new people and also the people that, I thought I knew.
Well, that's great information. From what you've learned so far and the research you've done leading into your experience, have you found a lot of differences in how farm transition practices in other countries compare to Iowa and the United States?
It's been really interesting that there are some really critical differences. And a lot of it actually has to do with the way that we view private property in the United States. So the United States is some of the most developed and longstanding private property laws in the world. I kind of came into this with the hypothesis that when we thought about other nations that have existed longer than the United States, that perhaps they would have longer lasting family operations. And it's actually turned out to be in the case that in many places, a lot of farms kind of average around that 2 to 3 generation mark, whereas you get to the Midwest and it's not uncommon to hear 4, 5, 6 or more. And so it's been interesting to hear how the laws that allow us to have our farms for a long period of time have then become started in a lot of places later on. So that's led to some differences in how people approach transition, either that they are operating in a new environment in a new way, or that they have an entirely different culture around transition. But some other things that play in is also how heavy-handed is the government in the transition of farmland, but then also what are the cultural expectations about who comes back and how do you make a place for that next generation when they come in?
Yeah, here in the United States, we know there are a lot of regulations, and at least we know what the rules of the game are here in Iowa and the United States about passing the farm along to the next generation. What's the situation in other countries as to the rules and regulations?
It varies from place to place. You have some nations where the country is only a matter of decades old. And so the laws are only a matter of decades old. And then you have some nations where there's been mass reform in who is where and how they farm. And then there's other nations where the families who farm the same land for hundreds of years, it's comparable to the United States. And so what's been most interesting from that is you realize how many people actually look our way as well to try and learn from us too. So that's been remarkable to learn. And I can't wait to come back with more of an answer at some time once I've been through this next round of travel.
Yeah, it's great to go out for you, gather all this information, and I'm sure you'll be overloaded with notebooks and whatnot of everything you've learned. How do you plan to compile and share your knowledge with people once the term of the scholarship is completed?
At the end of the scholarship, I will be completing a report based on all of the findings of the scholarship. And then that report will be made available through the Nuffield Foundation and then all of our people who've been supporters of the foundation as well. So that information will be passed on along, and I'm working to try and be able to pass that through a couple other channels back to farmers, whether that be farmer associations or through university, to just be able to distribute that. So the goal is just to make it as widely available as possible.
And hopefully for your sake, find something that will help you in your personal journey as well. Has your perspective on agriculture changed as a result of your experience so far?
It's changed substantially because, even here in the last month, we've heard an awful lot about the rains in Brazil that have been so tragic. I've been reading about it, and, in a past time, a year ago, I would have just read about it and been, oh my gosh, look at this thing that's happening. It's tragic. But now you've got friends who are in those places, or you go to somewhere else where something good is happening. They've got a great crop or something, and you can pick up the phone, you can call someone, and you can talk to them about it. And it's allowed me to be able to gain perspectives in a new way that I couldn't have before, because no longer do I have to read something and try and interpret it with my perspective. You can just pick up the phone and you've got someone who's living out what you're learning about in real time, and you can borrow their perspective. And that's been absolutely wonderful. And frankly, I've loved being able to take ideas that I'm thinking through for my own operation, bounce them off new friends, and they might say, yeah, we actually tried that here so many years ago and we liked it, or we didn't like it. Or they'll be like, hey, from my perspective, I think this will work because of, and they can say their perspective from their place. So that's honestly been, a wonderful thing personally, because it's just given you so many new friends who really have something really cool to say.
That's 100%. Same thing we hear from our Young Farmer Network, where folks from Northwest Iowa can get connected with people from the eastern side of the state and learn the things they have in common, and maybe use them as a sounding board, things you might want to discuss with them that maybe you're not comfortable discussing with someone who farms nearby. Let's talk a little bit about your future. Your next year, or 10 months to a year now, is pretty well booked, but what is your goals in the next 5 years, 10 years? Where do you see yourself at the conclusion of this scholarship going forward?
My goal here for the next few years is to be back in the farming operation full time. And so that's really what's exciting to me. So my wife and I are now back at the farm, and I'm doing the Nuffield Scholarship, but afterwards it's going to be trying to not only improve our operation and bring in new ideas and build up on what we've been doing, but it's also going to be a good chance to get involved in so many more parts of the agricultural community, because, just the same way that there is so much I've been able to learn from Nuffield, you're totally right about all the networks that we also have in the state and being able to share with other producers who are like-minded, not only abroad, but also right here in our state or across the Midwest. So my future looks like it is full of farming, new ideas, and making new connections right here.
And on a broader scale, how do you see farming evolving in Iowa and the United States? There's a lot of things happening really rapidly, right, with technology and artificial intelligence and a lot of different things that farmers have to stay on top of and changing really the way you work. So what is your view of what agriculture and farming will look like in the future?
I'm opportunistic. So the one thing that has remained the same is that Iowan producers have had this tradition of innovation. And so no matter what technology gets sent our way, we find ways to fit into our operation if it fits for us. And when I look around the world at some of the new requirements that are being put on grain or on products that are being shipped abroad, I see that a lot of places in the world really respect what we do here, and they're using us as sort of the benchmark. I was just talking to a friend who is a nutritionist in the UK who I met through the scholarship, and they're talking about how they're looking at soybean imports using mainly the US as sort of the model of what kind of a nation you should be purchasing soybeans from. And so that leads me to think that as long as we keep leaning forward when the right technology finds us or the right business opportunity finds us, that we're going to have really amazing opportunities here over the course of my lifetime. And it's just an exciting time to be in agriculture. So, as we see AI rolls out, we see precision farming adapts, these are only the first among all the things that will change. And I always think back to my grandpa saying, once upon a time, I didn't know what a soybean was. And now they're almost half the acres in the state. So it's hard to predict what the change is, but I'm excited because the level of prestige that we've achieved in the state and the way that people see us, and I know the determination of our farmers to adapt makes me pretty excited to be learning from the world and being able to apply it here.
Yeah, I'm sure when people hear that you're from Iowa, it really is looked at as a food production center, not only for North America, but for the world. What advice would you give to future Nuffield scholars or those considering applying?
The advice I'd give is reach out. Don't be shy. It's a network of producers who are prioritizing openness, prioritizing collaboration, and they really want to hear from you. If you're interested, just be in touch, because whether it's, opening your doors up for scholars or other farmers to come through and you get to spend time learning from them as well, or one day hopefully having the chance to go and see those operations, they're totally open and excited to talk to you. And honestly, they'd love to come learn from us just as much as like to get out there and learn from them. I've got a whole host of other scholars who've reached out to me and said, I've always dreamt of going to the Farm Progress Show. And for me, I'm like, well, fantastic. It's in Boone this year. So come on out to the farm and we'll swing through there as well. So, reach out, get a hold of us, and we'd love to talk.
Good stuff from Hans. Of course, we know just how important multi-generational farming is to many of you listening to this podcast. So we wish Hans good luck with his international research and look forward to hearing what he learns abroad. In the meantime, if you're looking to plan a transition for your own family farm, remember that Iowa Farm Bureau has a program for that. It's called Take Root, and our next Take Root Farm Secession Workshop for farm families will be on July 25th in Johnston. This workshop will cover how to strengthen and secure your farm's future with topics such as family communication and business issues, goal setting, estate planning concepts, and more. To learn more about our Take Root workshop and to sign up, use the link down in the notes for this podcast episode or visit iowafarmbureau.com/takeroot. Okay, one more announcement before we go. As we've mentioned in previous episodes, Iowa Farm Bureau is hosting a 2-day educational tour of innovative ag sites in western Iowa and Nebraska, and it's in just a few weeks. The 2024 Young Farmer Ag Insights Tour is July 11th and 12th, and it will include stops at Lonely Oak Distillery, the Elite Octane Ethanol Plant in Atlantic, Lincoln Premium Poultry, and more. If you're a young farmer or ag professional who would like the opportunity to learn while networking with your peers from across the state, be sure to sign up for the tour using the link down in the notes for this podcast episode or by heading out to iowafarmbureau.com. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us for the next one on July 1st. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.